Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sabir, and I direct events here at the Strand. Before we launch into tonight's event, I just want to share a bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until, after 93 years, the Strand is a sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. And we want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers, we wouldn't be here tonight. Tonight, we are excited to celebrate Asian Pacific American Heritage Month with an awesome panel of comic book authors and artists. Moderating this panel is Jean Luen Yang. In 2006, Jean's book, American-Born Chinese, was the first graphic novel to be nominated for a National Book Award and the first to win the American Library Association's Printz Award. It also won an Eisner Award for the Best Graphic Album, JNU, and in 2013, Jean released the 2-volume graphic novel, Boxers and Saints, which was also nominated for a National Book Award and won the LA Times Book Prize. Jean has done a number of other comics, including Dark Horse Comics' continuation of the popular Nickelodeon cartoon Avatar: The Last Airbender and DC Comics' Superman. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jean to the stage.
Hi, thank you. Thank you all so much for hosting us here at the Strand. Even though we can't get together in person, it really is an honor and a pleasure to get together virtually. So here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to welcome my fellow panelists up on the screen. And then afterwards, I'd like each of us to take some time to tell you all about our upcoming projects. So first, I'd like to welcome Sarah Kuhn, who is the author of this book right here, Shadow of the Batgirl. Second, I would like to welcome Victoria Ying, who is the artist of Diana, Princess of the Amazons. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome, Melissa De La Cruz, who is the author of this. I read this digitally, which is why I have to show it to you on iPad. All right, thank you all. Thank you all so much for being here. I'd like us all to talk a little bit about our book. So I'm going to start, and then I'm going to pass it off to each of you, okay? All right, so I have a book that just came out this week called Superman Smashes the KLAN. I did it with a Japanese art team called Guri Hiru. We had worked together on the Avatar comics before this. And we also added to our team Janice Chang, who is this legendary letterer. She, for years, lettered the daily Spider-Man strip that was written by Stan Lee. Together, we are retelling one of the most famous stories from the Superman mythos. Back in 1946, on his radio show, Superman actually took on the DC Universe version of the Ku Klux Klan. And supposedly, this storyline had a real-world effect. After this storyline aired, the real-life KKK experienced a tremendous drop in their membership. At the center of this story, way back in 1946, was a Chinese-American family, which is one of the reasons why I really wanted to adapt it. I'm so glad that DC Comics said yes to this project. And I'm also so glad that I got to be a part of the new DC Young Readers line, in part because of all of the amazing books that are part of this Young Readers line. I, as a lifelong superhero fan, I really do think that the books that are represented on this panel, or the books that are part of this line, are the future of superhero comics. So next, I'd like Sarah Kuhn to talk a bit about her book, Shadow of the
Sure. So Shadow of the Batgirl is my book with the amazing artist Nicole Gu, who I have talked a lot about because part of it is set in a library and she had to draw a lot of books, and I felt very bad about that afterwards. And we also worked with an amazing colorist named Chris Peter, and actually Janice Chang also lettered our book. So that is super awesome. I think she's edited, or she's lettered like half the books for DC Young readers. It's pretty amazing. But this book is about Cassandra Cain, who I've been obsessed with for years. She's the Asian American Batgirl. I remember when she first showed up and when she eventually got to be Batgirl and had her own Batgirl title. It really blew my mind that a biracial Asian American girl like me could be Batgirl. So our book is kind of a retelling of her origin story. We really wanted to put you in her POV. She's basically the daughter of one of the most powerful supervillains in the world, and he's brought her up to be a living weapon. She has basically been trained to be this badass assassin and nothing else. And so our book is about what happens when she decides to defy that training and runs away and starts on the hero path and ends up being fascinated by a hero who hasn't shown up for a long time in Gotham City called Batgirl. And she also makes some new friends who you can see here. One is Barbara Gordon, who is librarian in the Gotham City Library, which is kind of where Cassandra ends up making her new home. And the other that you can see in some of these images is Jackie, who is our creation. She's an older Japanese American auntie who owns a noodle shop and has a few secrets of her own. And I've talked a lot about how one of the important things for me with this book was to give Cassandra a true mentor who is also an Asian American woman, because that's certainly been important to me in my life.
I thought all of that. I know it was a pain for Nicole to draw those. But I totally thought it was worth it. I felt like you really made the library seem like this really cool hideout, right?
Yeah, she is amazing. She also drew like all of these I'm like pointing to it, even though you can't see where I'm pointing to. Like the roses on Cassandra's cape, like just the detail in this book. I just want everyone to know that that's all because of her and none of it is because of me. She is amazing.
I think you're selling yourself a little bit short, because I think that the ambiance of the library as a superhero hideout, that's as much about the words as it is about the pictures.
Thank you.
Well, so next I'd like to invite Melissa to talk about her book, Gotham High.
Sure. So when DC said they were doing a YA line, they wanted to chat with me and asked me if I would be interested in writing a graphic novel for their line. And I said, sure. And they said, you know, nobody has done Batman yet. Would you be interested in doing Batman? And I said, wow, that's amazing. Yeah, sure. Who doesn't want to do Batman? So the idea is that Bruce Wayne, Selina Kyle, and Jack Napier, who grow up to be Batman, Catwoman, and the Joker, are all in high school together and have a history together. Because I thought, you know, what makes the best enemies is former friends, you know, so there's a little bit of a tragedy behind that. And Bruce has been kicked out of his fancy boarding school, Arkham Prep, and has to go to Gotham High, where he meets Selina, who is the former girl next door, and Jack, who he actually becomes buddies with. And in the course of the story, of course, there's crime and tragedy and duplicity. So it's a really fun book.
I've read superhero comics since I was a little kid. I'm a lifelong superhero fan. And what surprised me about this book is that there are no costumes, but it still feels like a superhero book. Like I felt like you struck a really wonderful balance between something that felt very familiar and unfamiliar. You know, that in between spot, right? Like these are my old friends, but I'm seeing them in a new way.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I liked reinventing it and then having a few Easter eggs, you know, because everybody knows, you know, Batman's background. I mean, we all know his parents were killed in front of him. We all know he was orphaned, he's broken. But to try to put those same things on a different story, I think is always really fun.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, next I would like to invite Victoria to talk about this book.
Hi, everybody.
Princess of the Amazons.
Yeah, my name is Victoria Ying, and I was the illustrator on Diana, Princess of the Amazons, written by Shannon and Dean Hale. The story is basically about a young Wonder Woman and how she's the only kid on the entire island and how lonely that can be, and growing up and kind of making mistakes and trying to find herself both as a superhero and as a kid.
This book is super popular at our house. I live with an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old. They're they're from my gene pool, but they love this book. They pass this book back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. It's great. So here's the first thing I want to talk to you all about. Each of you has had a pretty storied career before this. So Melissa, you've been a #1 New York Times bestseller. You've worked on a Blue Blood series and the Descendants series for Disney. You've even had the Witches of the East End turned into a television series, right? These are big deals. And then Sarah, you're the author of the very popular heroine complex novels. And you also have this romantic comedy book called I Love You So Mochi, which has gotten all sorts of awards. And Victoria Ying, you've worked on like movies that everybody's seen. You've worked on Tangled and Wreck-It Ralph, Frozen, and Paperman and Big Hero 6. The DC Young Readers line, when you all entered, was not a thing. It didn't actually exist, right? We are actually moving into this spot. So how did you move from all of these really big projects into something that did not yet exist? What brought you in? Can I start with Sarah?
Sure. Yeah, I know it's always kind of awkward on the Zoom panel. You're like, do I talk? Do you talk? It's like that in Force Awakens with Poe, where he's like, who talks first? But yeah, I mean, it was kind of similar to what Melissa was saying. I think my agent got an email that was basically like, we're starting this line. We're kind of interested in these authors. Here's a list of characters that we sort of want to highlight if you have any pitches on any of them. And the list of characters that they had initially sent was kind of, I guess, the ones you sort of expect, like a lot of the characters who are in TV and movie properties, kind of the heavy hitters like Supergirl and Wonder Woman and, awesome people like that. And Batgirl was on the list. And my agent asked them, because she knows I love Cassandra, is this just Barbara Gordon or can it be any Batgirl? And honestly, to be perfectly honest, I was shocked when they were like, no, it can be whatever sparks the most imagination. We're really looking to kind of bring in new readers. There's no barrier of entry. There's no continuity. These books are kind of all their own little separate continuities. So I submitted, I think, initially 2 pitches. One was Cassandra and one was Starfire. And I thought, honestly, the other one they would go for more because I felt like, she's in the Teen Titans, like she's really popular, maybe a little bit better known. And the one they kept being interested in was Cassandra. And I keep saying, like, I know it sounds silly now that it's like a whole book, but I keep saying, like, I was surprised at every step when they kept saying, like, no, keep going with Cassandra, because I think, at least for myself, I'm so used to kind of zeroing in on the Asian American character, which is like what I always want to do. Like any woman of color, I'm like, that's the one I want. And I'm so used to that being kind of a barrier, like that being like, no, that's not the one we want. So like, try this other more popular white character. And I was super excited that they really let me run with Cassandra. And I actually was talking a little bit when we could still go outside of our houses to Michelle Wells, who is like, the big executive editor, like amazing person in charge of this line. And she said, like, she was like, oh, I'm surprised that you were shocked by that. And I kind of explained it. She was like, honestly, I could tell from your pitches that was the one you wanted. Like, it had so much more passion. It was obvious that was what you really wanted to write. And I was kind of like, oh, well, I'm not totally used to people being like, that's the one you want to write, and also you can do it. So I was super excited, and I was really excited that they wanted to kind of put a spotlight on Cassandra, because really until this year when she was, you know, in the Birds of Prey movie and in this book, and kind of coming back into some of the main DCU titles, we hadn't seen very much of her. She hadn't really been in the spotlight. So I was just to say it again, really excited.
I think it comes through. I think it definitely comes through
Thank you.
in both the story itself and also the text piece that you wrote to accompany it.
Thank you.
I think it's great. How about you, Melissa? So you have worked in other universes before, right? You worked in the Descendants universe, so you're a little bit used to that. But this still must have felt like kind of a jump for you, I'm guessing.
Yeah, it was funny because I was kind of in the middle, I think, of the final Descendants book, or maybe the third. I can't remember. It's all kind of a blur now. But yeah, it was interesting to go from the Disney universe to the DC universe. And what was exciting about DC was, you know, I said, oh, I should read all the Batman comics, you know, that I haven't read. And they said, no, don't do that. We want you to write your own story, you know, and, you know, it's out of canon. It's not, you know, it doesn't have to, you know, kind of fold into what's come before, which was very different from the Disney gig, which was, you know, we were really careful about making sure the books kind of matched up with the original movies. And that was actually the fun part of that, was, you know, referencing all the old stuff. But with the DC line, you know, they really wanted us to bring kind of these YA stories to these familiar characters. So my first pitch, which, you know, is still kind of the book that happened, was Gossip Girl meets Batman. and Bruce Wayne, you know, was a little bit more of a Chuck Bass character. And they said, well, you know, he still has to be Bruce Wayne. He has to be kind of broody and alone. He can't be kind of this great Gatsby-like character. I was like, oh yeah, you're right. So then that was, you know, it was kind of interesting to bring, you know, what I had with what they also needed. I think the biggest challenge was writing a graphic novel, because I had never done that before. And I think that was also the most fun part of it, so that it wasn't a prose novel. So it was kind of like learning how to ride a bike a little bit, how to tell a new story.
So I've done both books where I've done the writing and the drawing, and other books where I've done the writing. And when I'm only doing the writing, one of the funnest parts is you send in the script, and then all of these pages come into your email box, and they're beautiful, and you don't have to work for them at all. I'm sure you had that experience, right? With your
yeah, it was like opening a present. It was like, wow, look at that. It was cool. Yeah.
Now Victoria is the one that actually has to do all that beautiful art that gets sent through email, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about how you came into this project, how you came into the DC Young Readers line?
Yeah. Nice segue, by the way. So yeah, I started with the DC because just kind of like we had this like science fiction writers like mixer thing that we do in LA. And at the time, like I was still kind of in the film world and just trying to leave and do comics. I was working on my own original titles, but nothing had, you know, been purchased or anything. So when I introduced myself to one of the editors, she's like, oh, I'm an editor at DC. And I'm like, oh, I draw comics. And she's like, anything I've heard of? And I'm like, no. But she took my card and then emailed me later that day to be like, hey, I like your stuff. Would you be interested in this title? And like really this project was a dream project for me because I've been a big fan of Shannon and Dean Hale for a long time, and working on a Wonder Woman book on top of that, just I was like, this is perfect and I want it so bad. So the first thing that we did was kind of do some sketches because we knew it wasn't going to be canon, and she was going to be represented in a way that we hadn't seen before, and they really wanted to make it very accessible for kids. This is actually my first full-length graphic novel project too. I have another original book coming out in July, but this is my first published graphic novel. So there was a little bit of a learning curve for me too, but thankfully Shannon and Dean, because they've had so much experience doing graphic novels, they actually kind of taught me my own process in writing graphic novels, because their writing was so concise and so clear and very, very simple for me to understand. And they didn't put too much action in the panels, and just it was also really interesting because I've worked with publishers before because I did a lot of picture books. And in those projects, I never speak to the author. Like it's editor only. So it was really interesting with DC that we got to like send the pages to the author every week along with the editor. And for me, working with Shannon and Dean, every time they were just like gushing and just really supportive. So that was a real positive working with them.
Well, it turned out great. I get why they're gushing. Your pages are really gorgeous.
Thank you.
Yeah, and can I ask what the other book that you have coming out is called?
Yes. So my original graphic novel, it's called City of Secrets. It's being published with Penguin Viking, and it comes out July 28th, 2020.
Awesome. So we'll all have to check that out.
Yeah,
now,
order from the Strand.
Yes. Yeah, that'd be great. So this month May is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. So I do want to talk a little bit about that. And I want to start with Victoria. This is not an explicitly Asian American book, but it felt really Asian American to me. Did it feel like that to you?
I mean, I think that there's a lot of the loneliness and isolation parts about her growing up that felt very similar in my own experience. I grew up in a neighborhood that was predominantly white, and I was like the only Asian kid. So I know what that feels like to feel like, oh, I'm the only one of me.
Yeah.
And, I really related to that feeling in the book. I think the other thing that makes it feel very Asian American is that like my influences were coming from manga more than maybe traditional Western comics. So a lot of like the expressions and the faces have kind of an Asian tilt to them, even if it's not like necessarily on purpose.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I could totally see that. And I think that's part of the reason why it appealed to my daughters, because they're huge manga fans. I think almost any kid nowadays wants to read something that's a little bit manga influenced at least. The other part of the book that felt very Asian American to me is kind of like the bad friend. You have a bad friend, and I have this friend who is an immigrant from Korea, and he told me that the very first friend that he made after he got here, when he could barely speak English, was this kid who constantly picked on him, and he didn't realize it until he could speak English a little bit better.
Yeah.
So was that like I do feel like you put something into the visuals with that bad friend character, that like how did you wrap your head around that?
I mean, a big part of it for me was, Shannon and Dean, the way that they write children in such a way that like I've forgotten a lot of my childhood, but reading their books puts me right back there in a way that's really authentic and it doesn't feel like an adult wrote it. It's like it really does come from that childhood experience of, these things that you do that you're uncomfortable with, but you're also like, oh, but I want to seem cool, and this is the only person who's willing to be my friend, so like I'm not willing to take those chances to lose them, so I'll do this thing that I don't actually believe. So like that was a big part of it. And for me, visually thinking about that character, originally she was kind of described as looking just like Diana, like a copy of her almost, but I wanted that to feel different. I experimented and I drew her a little differently because I wanted the character makes a transformation at some point, and I wanted to make sure that we visually connected those two characters as the same one instead of just having it be such a mimic of Diana.
I see. Okay, so the fact that she looks like she's made as opposed to she's an actual person, the fact that she looks like
yeah like she was originally supposed to have like Diana's hair and like look just like her, except clay. But so we made that choice creatively to kind of separate them, so then it didn't quite feel like she was just creating a clone, but like was really creating a friend.
Yeah, I think that worked great.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, Melissa, what you did was you took a story that in continuity is not an Asian American story, and you made it Asian American. Do you want to talk about how you made that transition?
Yes, I was thinking about why Gotham High meant a lot to me, and when you mentioned Witches of East End becoming a TV series, and when one of my books much earlier on got optioned for Hollywood, my dad was so excited about it. And then he said, and it wasn't Witches of East End because he had passed away by then, But he said, oh my God, if it becomes a Hollywood movie, I want to be in it. I'll play the driver. I'll play the butler. I'll play the chauffeur, and it was just so fun. And he was an investment banker who had his own driver. But, we understood what our parts were in Hollywood, like where, somebody like a 50-year-old man or a 60-year-old man could be in a Hollywood movie. And so I always laughed about that, that my dad would be so humble and also kind of just like practical about it. Like even if I created it, he knew what part he would play. And then so I thought, to go from that kind of thinking to saying, we get to be Batman. Batman can look like my brother or my dad when he was young. I gave him, he's part Chinese like me. My brother lives in Hong Kong. It was just this huge kind of step of saying, this all-American iconic character can be Asian American. And I remember asking DC and saying, oh, one of the things I want to do is make Batman Chinese. Is that okay? And they were like, yeah. I mean, they were kind of like, you don't even really have to ask, you could have just written it. And I said, wow, that's kind of crazy that, that there was, they were totally open to it. And for me, it was more giving myself permission to really feel that I could do that. And I think I've said this before in other panels, but, when I saw Hamilton and seeing an African-American man play somebody like Thomas Jefferson, just really kind of opened up like, okay, we can step into the center stage, of these stories.
Yeah. Because Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, the three pillars of the DC universe, all have black hair, my younger brother and I used to just joke all the time that they were actually all Asian.
There you go.
Now, Sarah, you actually drifted towards a character who is Asian in continuity, but you built out her cast in a much more diverse way that I think we normally see in Bat Family comics. Do you want to talk about that? How you built out that cast?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it was like kind of a starting point of what Melissa was saying, where I just like another question that's kind of come up sometimes for me with this book is people asking like, well, why does she have to be Batgirl? Like, why can't she be like a new identity or orphan or Black Bat or like, something else? Like, why does she have to be Batgirl? And I feel like that always comes up whenever we talk about like casting of something like, oh, couldn't this person play this? And people are like, well, no, that's not really how it is. Why don't you just create your own new character? And I'm like, okay, well, I did that as well. Like I write Asian American superheroines I created, but I also think that these very classic epic mantles mean something. Like they still mean something, and it means something for a kid to be able to see that Superman or Batman or Batgirl can be Asian American like them, and they don't always have to be the sidekick. So that was kind of the starting point of that, was I just wanted her to be centered as Batgirl. And then as far as building out the supporting cast, like I said at the beginning, like one thing I really wanted was for her to have an older Asian American woman mentor, because as much as I love Barbara and Bruce and all of the mentors she's had in the DCU, I just thought that was really important. I think that a lot of times we don't really believe something is possible until we see it. I know that was certainly true for me. And when I was able to see like Asian American women being novelists and being creative and doing artistic things, that was something that really helped me see that I could do that as well. So I really wanted her to have this mentor who was basically a classic Asian auntie who was like always trying to get her to eat and wears like really loud clashing patterns and wears like Adidas slides with socks. And it was just like all of those things that I think of as being actually kind of culturally important. Like I wanted that to sort of come through, and to have Cassandra have someone who she could look up to in addition to Barbara, who kind of looks like her and could be related to her. And, they kind of have that extra bond. And then I also wanted her to have a really cute love interest, of course. So he created Eric, who is also biracial. He's Blasian. And he talks about that a little bit throughout the book. And I thought that would be nice for her as well, to have like someone in her life who's a peer, who's Asian American, but also mixed race. And they could kind of connect on that level. And I kind of like the idea that, you know, she has been so kind of kept inside by her father. She doesn't really have a lot of cultural touchstones. She's really just been raised to be a weapon. So one thing I like about Eric, who is the very attractive biracial jock love interest, was that he could kind of bring up some of those things. Like he could sort of, he talks at one point about how he has like a tiger dad. He talks about, you know, the sort of pressure to succeed. He talks about sort of these things that were kind of, you know, touchstones in my life or touchstones in other people I know's life. And that is in a way kind of her first introduction to sort of some classic Asian American mixed race kid things that she's getting from someone who's a peer. So those were sort of the things that I think we kind of wanted to add to the canon. And I did want to make her story very Asian American. And one of the things that like that has been kind of the most moving about the reception for this book is a lot of Asian American readers have told me this, like, I can't necessarily explain what it is or point out specific examples, but when I was reading this book, I felt like it was a very Asian American story.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask, was there an actual Asian auntie person in your life who was kind of like your hero and your mentor?
I mean, there were a lot. I mean, certainly, you know, my mom, my actual aunts, my grandma, my great aunt, like all these people were kind of touchstones in my life who like, even if they weren't writers, even if they weren't pursuing like a creative profession, even if they weren't that much like me, they sort of showed me that I could be in the world and I could be a badass and I could, you know, wear whatever I want and like kind of have my own voice and my own personality. And I think like, you know, like, yeah, all the women I'm related to, certain friends I've had have a certain auntie vibe. Always trying to get you to eat. And then one person who I've been talking a lot about lately, because I wrote my latest heroine complex book is actually set in a haunted women's college that is similar to the haunted women's college I attended, is this professor, Vivian Chin, who was taught a lot of Asian American literature classes and really kind of helped me see like, you can write your own story. You can write in your own voice. You are worthy of being a protagonist. Someone who looks like you is worthy of being a protagonist. And I think having Vivian in my life at like such a key moment really helped me internalize that. So certainly, I think Jackie, our Asian auntie, was sort of like pieces of all of those people coming together.
Well, Vivian, I want to ask you, did you have somebody like that, like a Vivian type person, an Asian American mentor in your life, or even somebody you didn't know, who you only knew through a screen or through a page, who you saw as your hero?
I mean, like Asian American auntie is like such a, like for me, mine are all still back in Taiwan, but my grandmother is definitely that. My actual aunt, I used to go and live with them over the summers, so like I really did have that kind of hybrid experience of both living here and having that lifestyle and then also being a Taiwanese and that whole environment. Like there's just certain smells and certain like foods that they make that are totally reminiscent of those things. But yeah, like definitely Asian auntie, not even American, just like Asian auntie, like the older woman who is so in charge and, you know, just it was this powerful character in my life. And in the Diana, Princess of the Amazons, she's surrounded by aunties too. Like that's all she has. Every woman who's an Amazon is an aunt for her. And that's kind of also the template I was looking at for them. Yeah, and like the other thing about that is like there's a stereotype about Asian women being submissive, and in my head I was always like, have you like met an Asian woman? Because I don't know a single one who is that stereotype. They're all like mean as hell, you know, like they're very tough and very, very vocal and loud. So I'm always just like, where does that come from? Because it's not from real life.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. The women, I had a lot of Asian aunties in the church that I grew up in, and they always had advice about how to fix my life. You know, and usually it was right, to be honest. It was usually right, but they always had advice. So Melissa, you don't have an Asian auntie. You actually have an Asian uncle. I think
do.
that was a particularly poignant take on Alfred. I always felt kind of weird that like you know, the in continuity Bruce Wayne had a butler who was his mentor, but in your version it's actually an uncle. Do you want to talk about how you constructed Uncle Alfred?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because when I really thought about it, I was like, why did I make Alfred his uncle? And I thought about it and I said, well, he's a teenager. He's not gonna listen to his butler, you know, he needs somebody with a little bit more authority over him. And I've always liked the character of Alfred, and I thought it was more poignant if he was Bruce Wayne's mom's brother, you know, who's been in Hong Kong, who basically made Bruce a billionaire, you know, because he invested really well. And then I just, you know, it's so funny how much of it is subconscious. And I have a gay uncle, Edward. So I was like, oh my God, there's so much of Uncle Ed and Uncle Alfred. You know, he was like smooth. He always has all the everything. Doing well. You know, he always has everything right. So I think that was kind of a fun take on him.
Yeah, I thought the way the solution that you have for how an Asian guy could have the last name of Pennyworth was also a stroke. Yeah,
He's
married.
married.
There's lots of little strokes of genius with the Alfred character. I think also like making the whole Master Wayne thing a joke was really. I hope that's not spoilery, but I thought that was. Really
cool. No, I mean, you know, I think that's what's part of the fun. You know, are those little Easter eggs where you can see how the characters are kind of changed a little bit, but still themselves.
Yeah. I think that's actually one of the fun parts of the entire line for a long time DC reader, right? Like this is meant for kids, but if you're an adult reading these books, one of the fun parts is seeing all these pieces from all these comics that you've read since you were little show up in these really different ways.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. Okay, so we're getting close to the end. I want to leave some time for our audience questions, and I see some coming up on the chat. So let me read the first one, and let's see if we can all jump in to answer it. So the first one is, how do you reclaim or subvert the superhero genre when considering their historical use of racist tropes? Did any of you think about any of that while you were working on it?
I mean, I think maybe that was part of wanting to make these iconic characters more diverse, you know, because it has been such a, you know, a white space. And so it was kind of interesting to, you know, say, hey, we're the star this time. We get to be the hero. You know, I think just in that, you know, I feel like you should answer that, Gene.
Well, in Superman Crashes the KLAN, that one thing that Gurihiru and Janice and I did was we just recentered it a little bit. So in the original 1946 version, the Chinese American family is just part of the inciting incident, and they kind of disappear as the story goes on. But in our version, we keep them as the focus.
Yeah.
And I think Sarah did something similar too, right? Like Batgirl, you kind of made Cassandra Cain the focus of the name Batgirl.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that it is kind of what both of you are saying. It is a lot of times kind of a refocusing. I don't think any of us have yet taken on characters that were just sort of invented to be racist. Like there are some of those that I think it would be really interesting to see people subvert, like what they kind of came up with to turn that. But with Cassandra, I think the main thing was just we really wanted to be in her POV. Certainly she has had a lot of amazing books where she's the star and she's the center, and there was that Batgirl book for a while where she was the Batgirl of the title. But I think like one feeling that I kind of had was that we were always looking at her through sort of a lens. We were looking at her through maybe the lens of Bruce or the lens of Barbara, because she was kind of, you know, she couldn't speak, she couldn't understand language. She had sort of a hard time interfacing with the world in general because she had been raised to be this like, you know, living weapon assassin child. And so I felt like a lot of her story, we were kind of in sort of the classic books, we were kind of getting through the lens of other people, of them observing her and sort of like figuring things out about her and figuring out kind of how to make her come out of her shell, and her sort of teaching her how to talk, and her getting language for the first time. And I really wanted us to be in her head, basically, like really firmly in her head. And that was a challenge at first, because also in our book, she does not have a lot of language. She has been raised the same way she is in the classic book. She can't speak very much. She doesn't understand a lot. And so it was sort of like, okay, so we're in this person's head. How can we really convey what she's thinking? And what we kind of ended up doing was adding this voiceover that sort of is her narrating from a point in the future when she does have a little bit more language. We kind of see her learning things throughout the book, when she kind of has learned a little bit more about how to socially interface with people. But it was important to me that we sort of heard from her at every stage, whether that was through the voiceover or whether it was through the amazing way that Nicole drew her facial expressions and her reactions to people. And, you know, another thing I've said a lot on panels about this is that we actually ended up cutting a lot of the voiceover because what Nicole had done was so good and so expressive that it was like, oh, you don't need her to tell us that she's feeling this way, you can just see it. So certainly I think that like really brought it home, where it was like her story, you could really see through the body language and the gestures and the expressions and everything like that. But yeah, I think that was what our recentering was really making sure that this was a story that she was able to tell and that we were able to be with her the whole time, versus maybe hearing about her or seeing her through observations from other people.
Yeah. I had that same experience with Gurihiru. Like, you know, you get back the art and you're like, oh, my words are not needed anymore. This
Yeah,
the art is so good.
No,
and I'm sure the Hales had the same experience with Victoria as well.
Not so much, actually. I think that they did a really good job being very conservative, and the way that they would write some panels would just be like, she looks disappointed, and then like it would really be on me, you know, to be like, okay, you have to make that come across. But I've definitely had that in my own writing when I write my own scripts, and then when I thumbnail them out, like I lose probably like 10% of the dialogue that I had because it's just not necessary. But like to answer the question, for me, like as an artist, what I could do, because I wasn't in charge of writing the book, my refocusing was to try to look at the Amazons in a way that maybe wasn't so much through a male gazy lens. I wanted to make them feel like real women and strong women. I went to an all-girl high school, so I knew exactly what like female athletes look like. We were elite in, you know, basically all state, all the stuff, because as an all-girls school, we didn't have to split money with a male team, so we were very good. So like I know what like water polo girls look like, I know what tennis girls look like, and their bodies are very different than what we usually see. So when drawing all the background Amazons, I kept that really in mind, where I wanted to make sure that these women were diverse, not just in body type in terms of, you know, embracing all shapes, but also in terms of athleticism and the variety that we really get there. So yeah, like that was really my focus, was trying to be like, okay, this isn't about beauty, this isn't about making someone ideal, it's about making someone feel strong, but at the same time appealing and aspirational.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think it like it makes the Amazon society feel like a real society, as opposed to a society of robots who all kind of
right, like fembots. It's like
yeah, exactly. Well, okay, let me move on to another question. Do you remember your first Asian or Asian American story, historical or fictional in the media, and what was its impact on you? Did any of you have something that pops them in mind?
I mean, she was always a side character, but Babysitter's Club. She was kind of the first Asian character who I saw who had books like specifically about her. And she, it didn't ever feel like her race was something. I mean, it was unique to her, but at the same time, it didn't ever feel like it's like, oh, look at you, special, little creature who you are exceptional for an Asian person. It always felt like she was just another girl in their little Babysitter's Club.
Mhm.
That's the same thing I was gonna say. It's Claudia Kishi. I think it's interesting because I feel like once the internet sort of started to become more of a thing, I realized that she had been like such a touchstone for a lot of Asian American women of my generation, but also like sort of before and after, just because that series went for so long and she was always the main character. I mean, the second book, she's on the cover. It's Claudia and the Phantom Phone Calls, and that's her right on the cover. And one thing I really loved about her, to sort of like go with what Victoria is saying, is that she was one of the babysitters. She was also the coolest one. She had her own phone line. And she really busted that sort of model minority myth. Like, she was really bad at school. She did not do math well, which, like, I was mostly good at school, but I was really bad at math. So I felt like finally someone understands me. And, she was sort of known for being an artist and wearing these wild outfits and eating junk food and reading Nancy Drew mysteries and like hiding candy in all of her hollowed out books in her room. And I think that, to me, that still strikes me as pretty revolutionary, to have the Asian American girl, especially in an ensemble, be the cool one. Like, one thing I kind of talked about a lot is that like, there are also a lot of white women my age who they're like, no, Claudia was the best one. Like, Claudia was like the cool, like, she's the one everyone wanted to be. And I was like, okay, well, you guys got everything else, so you have to let us have this one. Like, we get to be Claudia. Like, I never got to be Princess Leia because you all said I didn't look enough like her, so I get to be Claudia. Like, that's just the bottom line. But the fact that she was like the coolest, even to people who aren't Asian American, I think is very powerful. Like, it's unusual still. And yeah, she was definitely the first person I saw that it was like Japanese American girl growing up in suburbia. I was like, that's me. I've never seen that before. So yes, still, I think very important.
Yeah, I think I missed the Babysitters by about 10 years. I was more the Sweet Valley High. And as you were talking, I was thinking, I never really felt like I saw myself anywhere in pop culture growing up. Like, so I can't even imagine what it's like now for those kids. Like, wow, like, do you take it naturally? Because like, I so naturally never saw it's just like, and it's kind of hard to explain to kids now. It's like, imagine never ever seeing yourself. And it's still kind of hard. But I also had an experience of growing up in the Philippines until I was 13. So growing up in a country where, everybody looks like you and they're, movie stars and soap stars and, it's Filipino TV with Filipino stars. So I knew what it was like not to feel at all other. And then when you immigrate here and then you are an other, I think I held on to that part of me because I had grown up enough with that. So I knew that, like, I didn't need to see myself in other things because I had grown up enough in a country where everybody was like me. I don't know, it's kind of hard to explain, but I know the first Asian story that I read in America was probably Amy Tan's Joy Luck Club. And that was huge. And talk about, just holding on to any little thing of like, okay, she's a writer, she made it, and I think when I wrote my first novel, I sent out a letter and it basically was like, this is an Amy, like, just to explain to people what it was, this is an Amy Tan for a new generation, because there was only her. I mean, you know, so that seems so sad. And it's so great now that there's so many more of us telling so many different kinds of stories. Like we don't have to write immigrant stories, we don't have to write trauma stories, you know, we can just write, you know, Claudia stories, which is great.
I know exactly what you're saying. I think it's hard for me to explain to my own kids that I'm raising what it used to be like. You know, the first Asian or Asian American stories that I encountered, I really wanted to avoid. I remember when 16 Candles came out.
Oh,
I really wanted to avoid,
right.
you know, I really wanted to avoid that movie. And then even at the comic shop, I remember, you know, Shang-Chi had his own series for a while. And I would never want to pick up that Shang-Chi comic because I was worried, like, if Chinese guy picks up a comic with a Chinese person in it, it'll highlight the fact that I'm Chinese, and it's not something I want to do. So to have a world now where, you know, you have books like all the ones that you all are making with actual, real, three-dimensional Asian or Asian American characters, I think is super important. Well, it looks like we only have time for one last question, and I do want to move on to kind of what we're already talking about. And that is, what do you think the future of Asian American representations in our stories is going to be like? The stories of our culture, not just the stories that the four of us are making.
I mean, I certainly hope that we get to a point where there is so much diversity within those stories, because obviously there's so much diversity within Asian and Asian American Pacific Islander identities. Like, it's such a huge umbrella, and there's so many different kinds of stories we can tell. And it still can be, I think, a little bit frustrating, because I think when there's something that's really successful, then everybody starts, it's like, oh, we want something like that, but nothing else. So like, as I'm sure you guys have seen, like, loved Crazy Rich Asians, like, have watched it so many times. But it's funny how, like, whenever a project sells now that has like Asian people in it, they're like, it's like Crazy Rich Asians meets like this other thing. And then you read the thing and you're like, this isn't like Crazy Rich Asians at all, except it has Asian people in it. Like, that's literally the only similarity. So I would love to move to a point where there are just like so many different comps and so many like successful Asian stories that we can all have our own thing. And I think that also kind of takes the pressure off of us, because I talked a lot about how, like, when Heroine Complex came out, people were like so excited. They're like, oh my God, I've been waiting for this my entire life. And I was like, oh, I suddenly feel very sweaty and uncomfortable, because this is not meant to represent like all Asian American women everywhere. So it'd be great if we had like so many stories that there was even like an Asian American superheroine genre where everyone could have their own, you know, their own thing that they feel like represents them and is the kind of story they like, so that the pressure isn't so much on one story to succeed. You know, it's not all on Crazy Rich Asians to like do so well at the box office that we can have more movies with Asian people. Like, I would just love to see that diversity of stories and diversity of voices coming out, so that all of us can feel like we have our stories out there.
I mean, I think thinking about it, the media has changed so much, even in the last 10 years. Like, the way that Netflix has really taken over and become like the main source of our news stories, and how broad it all is, in the sense that every niche can now be met. Like, there are these like really tiny niches of storytellers who are telling these very specific stories. And before, unless you can get like a massive audience, no one would invest, no one would make that thing. But now, because of Netflix and Apple TV and like, you know, all these competing places who are, they need content, like the drive for more of these unique stories and more of these like very specific stories are coming out more. And I think that that's like twofold. One, that's definitely on the TV and film side, and then there's also you know, the comic side of things, where like the internet has changed comics in a huge way. Like, web comics and Kickstarters and stuff like that, it's flattened the playing field, where now it's like we don't need to appeal to those gatekeepers anymore. We can just tell our stories and find our own audiences. So I think that like just we're in like a cultural shift right now, just in terms of like media in general. And I think that once we kind of come out of it, I think we're going to see a lot more of these very specific stories for very small audiences, but that are still being made and are still considered successful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. everything you guys said.
Yeah, I think just in general, it's a really hopeful time for Asian American representation in American stories, right? We've never seen this many stories come out, but I also don't think that we're at the finish line by any means. Specifically, just really practically speaking, I would love to see way more stories about Southeast Asians. I don't think there are a lot of Filipino American stories out there either. I feel like that's kind of a there's kind of lack. I think East Asians, for whatever reason, are starting to get more stories out there. But I'd love to see the diversity of the Asian American experience represented in our stories as well. Exactly what you all are saying. Yeah. Well, it looks like we are just about out of time. I want to thank all of you for being here with me, and I also want to thank the Strand Bookstore. Thank you all so much for hosting this. This was a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Jean, Sarah, Victoria, and Melissa. If anyone hasn't picked up a copy of their books yet, please head right on over to strandbooks.com. And thank you for joining us all tonight. It was a fantastic conversation. I loved it. Rita, good night.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Happy Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, everybody.
Yes.
Awesome.
Bye.
Yay.